All right. So, starting up here, our new section, our section on the French Revolution. The first thing we're going to look at is the background to the revolution, the causes of the revolution, which takes place in France and really happens mostly in and around Paris. All right. So, um, let me just say to start this whole thing off, France for the previous 150 years before the revolution had a series of kings: King Louis the 13th, King Louis the 14th, King Louis the 15th, and then at the time of the revolution, King Louis the 16th, who had ruled with mostly absolute power. We've studied or talked about that in Europe at this point, it was common for kings to rule with absolute power. And we also know that in Europe, especially in France, the Enlightenment had been going on. There were people meeting in Paris, in France, discussing regularly how a better government would work. And in a large part, it's because they weren't satisfied with this government that had absolute power. They did not want a king who had absolute power. Let's talk about King Louis XVI, who's the king during the revolution. So his great grandpa and his grandpa, both good, strong kings who ruled with absolute power and were successful, expanding France and making it more powerful. Even his dad wasn't really a great king, but was able to keep it together. But King Louis XVI, we're going to find out is a very weak king. He was a very bad king from the very beginning. And in many ways, his weakness really enabled this revolution to take place at all. So another factor here is the American Revolution. Now, we talked about the fact that during the American Revolution, the French helped the colonists fight the English, who were their historic enemy. We remember that 10 years, 15 years before the American Revolution, the English took a bunch of land from France in what is now the modern United States. So there had been this rivalry, and the French had spent a lot of money helping the colonists defeat the English, and now they found themselves in debt with this weak king. And the king now is going to ask for some to raise taxes. Now, historically in France, in order to raise taxes, you had to get permission from France's legislative body, their kind of like our Congress or Parliament, and this was called the Estates General. And they hadn't had a meeting for over 150 years. And he calls together the Estates General. Now, the way this was set up was that there were three estates in France. They had a class system. And the first estate was the church or the clergy. The second estate was the nobility. It was the king and the nobles, the lords, the landowners. And the third estate was everyone else, which turns out to be 98% of the population. But here's the thing. When they voted in the Estates General, each of the three estates would only get one vote, meaning that the first and second estates, who are now 2% of the population, would always be able to join together and overrule the 98% of the population, who was the third estate. This is a picture from the period, and you see both the nobles writing on the back of the regular people. Let's talk about the third estate. Let's talk about what we might call the peasants. Yes, poor peasants made up 75% of the third estate. Many of them didn't own land, and they had to pay the rich landowners to live on their estates. Now, these people maybe once were serfs. They had gotten their independence as peasants, so they weren't as tied to their lord as they may have been as serfs. But Now, when serfdom was ended, what happened was they said, now you owe me rent. So before, when you were a serf and you kind of had to follow my orders, you didn't have to pay rent. You just had to follow my orders. But now you're a peasant, you can live on my land, but you got to pay rent. So in a way, they were still really reliant on their lords. Um, but the rest of the third estate are really going to be the people who are behind the beginning of this revolution. This is the growing middle class. These are people who live in the cities and who have good jobs in the city, largely in Paris or maybe Lyon. Bankers, doctors, lawyers, businessmen. Um, and they were growing in size and stature and financial strength. And of course, we know that money equals power. So these people are now kind of a force to be reckoned with. And we often call them the bourgeoisie, the famous bourgeoisie. Yes, in fact, they were quite bougie. Um, and this is where the Enlightenment ideas were being spread in Paris, in these salons by the rich upper class, Voltaire, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and others, of course, meeting and discussing these Enlightenment ideas. Also, in the years preceding the start of this revolution, they had some droughts and some issues with their harvests. So now poverty was on the rise. The nobles didn't seem to even notice that poverty was on the rise. And we're gonna see the king go into to try and raise taxes.